Other questions? I don't remember. Some of you asked me things during the break. Donna Haraway, somebody raised you. So, I'm not familiar with her most recent work. So I don't know what she's doing now with the dogs, etc. But what I know is the cyborg thing. And this is another problem for me. Perhaps she changed her mind on that point. Let's say what I know by her is the Cyborg Manifesto, and it was another. It was another trend from the, let's say, 80s. I don't know when did she write that book? It was in the 80s. Yeah.
Late 80s.
Sorry.
Late 80s.
Late 80s, yes. In which, because biology was considered as purely biopolitical, and it was seen as a biotechnological power, you had this very Heideggerian approach to biology as a kind of mechanism, as we said, and that's why the future was seen as something which would introduce mechanism within the living being. So this is the idea of the cyborg. That's prosthesis, technical, that you've seen also, I've seen I think many Cronenberg movies, that we would be cyborgs in the future, meaning that we will become biopolitical creatures at the frontier of the machine and the living being, in this indecision, indecidability between both. And in fact, what is happening today is precisely the contrary. Because of the discovery of epigenetic factors, we now know that nature, or the natural living being, has the ability to produce itself, to transform itself, and that we don't necessarily need a prosthesis for that. Okay? See what I mean? So the metaphor, the image of the cyborg is obsolete. Because we can replace ourselves out of ourselves. And in some industries today, because of ecological concerns, they are talking about biomedicine. Have you heard of that? So we should produce technical artifacts which imitate nature. So instead of implementing technology within nature, we have changed the general direction and are trying to produce natural beings out of technology. So it's quite the contrary of the cyborg trend, let's say. Okay? So we are, for example, imitating spiders in order to produce a certain kind of web or of fabric, imitating many living beings in their productions. So technology is now indebted to nature, not the contrary. So this also was totally unexpected like 20 years ago.
I have a comment. I don't know if it's relevant, but I recently read that in the theme of spiders, they just found a spider that is able to reproduce itself at full scale to disguise itself from predators. So it created a body double.
Oh really?
Yeah. How crazy is that?
Yeah.
I saw a picture, I don't know if it's true. Yeah. So it might be behind spiders.
It's very interesting. Spiders are very interesting. What else? And there were other questions? Or?
thing to say in terms
Yeah.
of chronology, because I'm no expert on Haraway's work either, but I do know that that was a paper that she ended up disavowing because of its reception history in the academy, and that in terms of the kind of discourse that was developed around like cyber feminism and this kind of question developing from her work, because it was published in '85, that paper originally, that she really felt that folks misunderstood it as an ironic gesture. That in the very beginning of that paper, it's, this is an ironicization of trying to make a comment on the question of the cyborg as a really kind of untenable figure, but it's like the trapping of irony, I suppose.
But I think it's not entirely ironic what she writes about the cyborg. But anyway, I don't know if you've seen the last Almodovar movie.
The Skin.
The Skin, what is it in The Skin I'm Living in Paddington? Yeah. Many people have been very critical of this movie because it starts with the transgender problem. It's the transformation of, if I remember well, of a man into a woman. Okay? So it's about that. It's about a surgeon who's making transformation in his laboratory. So he transforms a young man into a young woman. But in this operation, for some reason, the film changes its focus. And you see that the surgeon is also interested in producing. In order to make this transformation, he's working on stem cells, skin stem cells, in order for the young man to replace its own skin. Okay? He wants to create a new skin out of the old one using the stem cells of the person. So you have two, for me it's a fascinating movie, because it marks two epochs of biology and of the question of transformation in biology and in philosophy and in culture in general. Shows that transformation is not so much transgenderism, for example, than self-replacement. And that we now have to work on stem cells in order to let's say, deepen our understanding of transformation. Because until very recently, plasticity was understood as, well, I think that queer theory was the most extreme discourse of plasticity. It is clear that out of Foucault, I think after Foucault and in many texts, the notion that we could transform ourselves, we could produce out of our plasticity something, well, we could transform ourselves, was very much, has very much to do with transgenderism or queer theory of or even Judith Butler's book. It was about that. But this is a cultural transformation in a way, historical transformation. And what Almodovar shows is that we cannot have one, like historical transformation, without a biological one, which is we cannot produce the historical change of ourselves without also taking into account the plastic potential of our biological being. And so you have the two discourses in one film. And that's why, people were used to Almodovar's queerness in films, and here's to say, what is he talking about? Because it is true that you have a kind of transformation in the film, which is not so much about gender, but about, the potentiality, biological potential of transformability, dealing with stem cells. So I don't remember what the question was at the beginning. What was it? I don't know.
But is there a transformation going in the
Yes. She has a totally new skin.
I don't think so. Well, in the surface, yes.
In the surface, yes, but
But she or he is not transformed, because I think if she or he would have been transform, she would not have killed him.
Anyway, it's a very interesting film because well, many people, mostly from the many people, mostly queer, have seen this film as well. He's not rigorous on the topic. We're talking about gender transformation, and then we have this story of stem cells and transforming the skin. What is he talking about? It's not rigorous. And I think he's quite rigorous. I think he's absolutely fascinating because he says, no, we've reached another epoch of plasticity. So we're not able to transform ourselves, I mean, like sexually, or from, you know, when Foucault talks about self-fashioning or self-stilization, and it's true that the work on gender was the most convincing example, and Almodovar says, no, we're reaching another epoch of transformation when it starts very early at the level of the biological being. So you have the two discourses in one, which according to me makes this great film, which is not at all a lack of rigor, which is another approach to transformation, but I don't remember what the question was, some sort. But as I said, just before the break, we were talking about the impossibility now to distinguish, and I think the Almodovar's movie is precisely at this frontier, the possibility to distinguish between historical transformation, like conscious transformation, cultural transformation, political transformation. Impossible to distinguish this from biological developmental transformation. Okay. So, are there other? Yes.
What's the potential of for epigenetics to be misused, like the principles of biological determinism or misappropriated in eugenics? Like what can we understand about the logic of it that guards against a misappropriation to the social?
Well, this is our responsibility. I have no other answer to my question. Our responsibility. There's also another big problem which I didn't mention here, but which should be mentioned, which is cloning. Cloning depends almost entirely from epigenetic factors. So, as you know, it's a big debate. Wow, should we use that?
I mean, it's already embroiled in some ways in political and social.
So I think it's our responsibility, even if I'm personally tired of all these ethical discussions. Bioethics, it's, for example, in the US until very recently, the use of stem cells was prohibited, which is a crime. Remember Bush saying that it was anti-Christian to use stem cells because it was manipulating embryos, etc. So for that reason, the use of stem cells was forbidden. Fortunately, Obama just changed the law. And in France, you can use stem cells, but in very restricted conditions. So it's very ambiguous here also. It's our responsibility, and at the same time, all these ethical discourses on science are just inhibiting what is so essential in biology today. Personally, I don't understand how you can prohibit the use of stem cells. For me, it is incredible. So, of course, there can be misuses of this. But at the same time, if you just prohibit them in the name of responsibility or ethical care, then you refuse to see all the improvement potential of all these techniques and technologies. So instead of focusing all the time on the dangers, on misuse, what you call misuse, instead of being obsessed by that, let's see the other side. This is just what I would like to tell you. Let's see what is so interesting instead of all the time prohibiting, forbidding, saying, oh, biology is very dangerous, Sarah. Let's see the potential. And I think that in philosophy, nobody does that. It's all about the dangers.
It's also like another form of exclusion that we're talking about.
Of course.
You said before that the symbolic is already at work.
Is already, yeah.
Yeah, and can you, expand, then what happens to, the symbolic, as in, it's becoming actually part, so things like in language and so on, we cannot do, it seems, without.
No.
So it's interesting because at some point, in discussing, Foucault, Derrida, and so on, the symbolic was sort of the question mark, and now it's becoming the answer, and then opening up something else. Can you explain something?
It's about, you remember yesterday I said, then what is philosophy and what is continental philosophy? I think that today it's even more radical as a question because, well, the task of philosophy as a discipline, even deconstruction, is to produce the symbolic meaning of things. Okay? I can't see no other definition of philosophy. What else is it? Can it be? It's a meaning production of meaning. It's production of symbolization, of producing the value, the transcendental value of the empirical. For example, we talked about death this morning, Heidegger writing about death and being in time, saying, I will try to analyze, call that analytics, as you know, existential analytics. I will try to produce, let's say, the meaning, even if it doesn't use the term, the analysis of death. So the symbolic meaning of it, okay? And it is very clear that even in the most deconstructive discourses, like Derrida, Foucault, Gambin, I can't see, even Deleuze, so we'll come back to that, as we were to, I can't see anything more, even in Badiou, biology remains something really suspicious, okay? So, even in the most deconstructive discourse, this symbolic production is a spiritual, even if the term is not used, it is still a production, a spiritual production. Okay? Now, if we challenge this, and if we discover without the materiality of life, if we discover within it, at this most elementary level, even in a slug, if we discover that there's no living being without this biological self-interpretation and plastic potential, which works at way beyond consciousness, at the most elementary level, so if we discover that, if we discover that life is nothing else but its own symbolization, like an automatic process, then what is philosophy? But at the same time, I think that if you don't insist, well, if you don't put your own practice at risk, if you don't, at a certain moment, and I speak for you all, I mean, artistic practice, whatever, if at a certain point you don't put that to the test, to the very point where you say, then it is useless, what I'm doing is useless, because then, as I just said, what is philosophy, but you could ask what is art, what is science. If you don't feel, if you don't at a certain moment meet the most risky point of your practice, then your practice has no value. Okay? I think that philosophy can become something important simply because, well, as a result of its of the test of its absolute uselessness. Okay, philosophy is beginning to have some meaning for me because it is absolutely threatened by something else than itself. You see what I mean? If biology is deconstructing, is more efficient than philosophy in deconstruction, then what is philosophy? And this is why I'm doing philosophy. For me, it's not a reason to give up philosophy, it's a reason of going on doing it. You know, because I feel this tension. But then I don't know what to do. This is precisely my question at the moment. Okay? No? Yes, you want to?
I want to bring up the subject of Freud.
Of?
Freud.
Freud?
Sigmund Freud,
Yeah, yeah.
from neuroscience to epigenetics. So in the meaning that you said that philosophy is going after science and is not all this process of like introducing the concept as a brain, that this connection of the body that produces a signifier. Did not Freud touch upon it?
Well, thank you for this question, which is an enormous. So you were talking about the debate about viruses, but the debate on Freud, because of neuroscience today, is a big thing. So, you know, neurobiology is not unified. You have dissensions everywhere, you have conflicts everywhere, and neurobiology is a very conflictual science. The trend I'm interested in is called neuro-psychoanalysis. So the people I read in neurobiology, Damasio, Oliver Sacks, Mark Souls, these people are open to Freud. Okay? So they are questioning psychoanalysis from the point of view of the brain. Right? So I say that because many neurobiologists don't take Freud seriously and consider that Freud never worked on the brain, in fact, that he was an idealist, etc., etc. So, okay, so we're talking about the contemporary debate in neuropsychoanalysis between the psychic unconscious, discovered by Freud, and the neural unconscious, which is an idea which is defended by the people I was talking about. Okay. So as you know, Freud's first book, The Entwurf, was a book on the brain, was about the brain, and the different ways of imprinting, was about neural memory. And then, as you know, Freud gave up his first approach to say very clearly that the psychic apparatus and the unconscious has, of course, some biological roots, but is not biologically located in the body, that it is an imaginary topic. You know that there are topics in Freud? That the psychic apparatus is imaginary meaning symbolic. It doesn't exist anywhere. You can locate the brain, but the unconscious is not nowhere. You can't say my superego is in the frontal lobe. Doesn't it? Well, so this is what Freud said at some point. He turned his back against his past as a neurologist to become a psychoanalyst. And the difference is that even, as I said, the psychic apparatus has biological roots, it is not biologically situated anywhere in the body. So you can have, I think, two discourses. You can have a double approach to that. Mark Solms wrote a book. Perhaps you want me to write that one more? It's fascinating, very interesting. Mark Solms is a fascinating. He's both a neurologist neurologist and a psychoanalyst. He's South African. And he wrote that book called Freud, A Moment of Transition. So this is the first approach, saying, okay, if Freud has changed his mind about neurology, if he has felt the need of interrupting his career as a neurologist, if he said that in the end the psychic apparatus was not biologically rooted, it is because neurology at the time wasn't sufficiently developed for Freud to inscribe the unconscious within the brain. Neurology was not evolved enough. So psychoanalysis is just a moment of transition between two epochs of neurology.
Couldn't you divide at some level epigenetics of the brain development as some kind of reapproaching the Freudian?
Yes, but the second approach is on the contrary, the one who says, no, there's no way of psychoanalysis has just to be superseded, because no, there can't be any, what Freud said about the unconscious is not accurate to understand what happens in the brain. Okay, so I'm rather close to the first approach, that there's a very close proximity between psychoanalysis and neurology, even if Freud used a different language. But the big problem is that, of course, we can use epigenetics to define a neural unconscious. But the problem, and it brings us back to this question of subjectivity again. You know that for Freud, you can phrase everything. Okay? You can it is the basis, as you know, of psychoanalysis. How can you phrase neural plasticity? This is the problem between the very great debate between the notion of the neural unconscious and the psychic unconscious, is that the neural unconscious remains beyond words. Okay, we don't know what it is. Yes, even if we accept, Marx won't accept to define the brain as a new form of psyche. He says, yes, we have a neural unconscious, but the problem is, just as I said, how is it possible to subjectivate our biological being? How is it possible to talk, to speak our brain? It's not so much to talk about it, but to let it speak. Right. And this is a major difficulty in psychoanalysis. That's why most psychoanalysts just dismiss neurology. Okay? Because the symbolization we were talking about, like this capacity to transform ourselves now, remains unsymbolizable. That's the problem. See what I mean? It comes before language. It's a very operation of life itself. It operates at a very elementary level, which is biological, which is not, you were talking about words this morning. This comes much before, bios and zoe and everything. It's very elementary. Then the problem is, how can we symbolize, that is, transform into symbols, that is, into words? How can we do that? Which is, to my sense, the task of philosophy today. You see? Well, this is the problem. And this is the big difficulty. What I'm talking about is a kind of automatic symbolization of life, the biological automatic symbolization of life, but the big problem is that this symbolization remains unsymbolizable at the moment. You can talk about it, but you cannot make it talk. You cannot. It's difficult to transform it into words because nobody can feel its own brain, for example. Okay? Which is also fascinating.
Can I ask you what you're thinking about, since we talked about Freud, we talked about Jung, and what
But
some,
yeah,
yeah, and what some people are doing in physics.
no, I don't know. I don't see what you mean.
There are some physicians working in psychiatry on synchronicity and trying to explain the thinking process in terms of physical structure.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't know about that. But it
And
makes me
using Jung rather than
Freud.
Yeah.
But there was the movie or something.
I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it either. I've been told it was very interesting, the relationship between Freud and Jung in this movie. But, we were talking yesterday about the difference between analytic and continental philosophy. Perhaps it's a difference that analytic philosophy and mostly cognitivism dismisses my question, like how is it possible to produce the symbolization of this symbolization? Right? How is it possible to subjectivate our biological being and to find the right language for that non-linguistic kind of symbolization? Cognitivists will say we don't need that. We just need to study the processes of the production, biological production of language. We just have to study how the brain produces the cognitive processes. Okay? Responsible for language, for example. So what philosophers have to do is only a description of cognitive processes. Right? If we describe how the brain is producing language out of this first biological symbolization, that's enough. And this is all we have to do. We don't have to produce any metaphysical discourse about that. Just describe the way in which language is produced out of this elementary phenomenon we're talking about. But I don't think it's enough. And I think perhaps this is the difference with continental philosophy, is that I think that we don't only have to describe this, we have to produce, as I said, a subjective approach to it. That we have to it's difficult to say. It's not a description, it is a critical approach of language. What is language doing with that? Is it only a reproduction of this elementary symbolization of life, or is it something different? It is an interrogation about the value of language and expression and symbolization. It's not only a description. Yes, I interrupted you.
Well, no, sorry, I was just going to say, it seems to me that, like, without that subjectivization, that you then fall on the other side of that line you were talking about, where it doesn't, there's no point to it in a certain sense, that it like reaches that point and goes over it, because I don't know, I just can't see any point to just describing it without locating a subjectivization.
Well, I think I will address that in my lecture tomorrow, because if you take then biology seriously, if you say that life is already producing its own symbolization by itself automatically without the intervention of a history or of a subject, then we have to stop talking about subjectivity, as I said, and we have to just describe things, be neutral observers. So you will ask then, what is philosophy? Philosophy is then, for them, I'll talk tomorrow, I think, about a German cognitivist, whose name is Thomas Metzinger, who wrote that big book called Being No One. Okay. It's a big book on the brain, it's fascinating also. Very technical, but very interesting. It really shows we are no one, we don't have any subjectivity, because we, as subjects we have nothing to do. Biology is doing everything for us, and the production of symbolizations thereon. There is a fundamental plasticity which operates at the level of life. So philosophy has nothing to add to that. But the task of philosophy is to make us aware of that. But that's why he remains a philosopher. If we describe all these processes, we will explain why subjectivity has to be neutralized, why we don't need these concepts any longer. Okay? So philosophy becomes a new kind of deconstruction of philosophy. Like all our concepts are empty. So what we have to describe is the absence of subjectivity. We have to describe our own emptiness. We are no one. So you have, well, you know, it is a very important, you were talking about Graham Herman recently, but also Ray Brassier.
Yeah.
Well, in his book Nihilism and Bell. Nihil and Bell, yeah. He talks about Metzinger.
Yeah.
So philosophy should become a new kind of nihilism in this sense, okay? In this sense. Like, enough with subjectivity, with this concept, even with deconstruction. We just have to contemplate the biological automatic deconstruction of subjectivity. Yes.
I'd be interested when you think about the practice of automatic writing, when thinking mostly of the surrealist practice, keeping people awake for days, and having them, enforcing them to write everything that comes to their mind right away. Is that the new writing practice of philosophy?
It might be. I didn't think of that. But why not? Why not? Yeah. But undoubtedly, this biological deconstruction of subjectivity has given way to an important movement in philosophy today, like Brassier, Herman, and object-oriented philosophy means that we have to give up this notion of subjectivity precisely because it's void, it's empty. So the only thing we can do is to describe this deconstitution of subjectivity. So you have this approach, but I don't think it's not mine. I do think that we have to elaborate something which is, a new kind of subjectivization of
without getting into sandbox politics regarding thinkers, I think that that's precisely the point where Harman and Brassier's projects divert and become completely incompatible, in the sense that Harman would say that philosophy is never, that at this moment the question of illusion and elusive language and reference become of the utmost importance, in the sense that a kind of a latent belief or a latent scientism that's at work, or sometimes in Brassier's work, is really never been a question for philosophy in a way. That's all of it.
I don't really know. I just know if you want the general tendency of that. What I know is that Brassier very explicitly refers to Metzinger as a basis and as a way of, as I just said, of produce a reflection about this desertion of subjectivity of the subject. Okay, so the subject is not the production of plasticity of self-transformation is not a production of the subject. It operates at a very elementary level of life. Okay. So then what is philosophy? Philosophy is just the accomplishment of a certain kind of nihilism, right? Which is the defeat of subjectivity. And now, of course, you're right, there are differences between Harman and Brassier, but I don't know. I think there's a possible other approach, which instead of just describing the defeat of subjectivity, is on the contrary trying to perhaps produce a new concept of, the subjective effects of such a disaffection of subjectivity. Okay? So how now will we deal with our biological being? What is philosophy doing with the production of this new bios of the Zoe? What is the philosophical translation of this biological operation? You see? Well, what is, I'm interested in the effects produced by the discovery of the biological potential. I'm working, for example, on my own case. What kind of change did the discovery of all that, and consequently the collapsing of all my adhesion to deconstruction, continental philosophy, like this kind of this big change in my life that all that has produced, what kind of effects did it have? And when I talk by myself, it's not myself. It is something that we should, all of us do. I mean, what is the effect on this kind of discovery on the subject? You know, what is the effect of the discovery of my own biological plasticity? How can I? What do I do with that? So this would be my approach. What is the effect, like the secondary effect of that on thought? How can our spirit react to its own biological being? See what I mean? But it is very clear that biology has, in many respects, superseded deconstruction. You know, because of self-replacement. You know, Derrida still talks about the graft. We don't need it. Well, soon we won't need any graft because we will be able to replace ourselves. So self-replacement, cloning, the possibility of changing, difference, deprogramming, reprogramming, the total plasticity of life. I think this goes far beyond philosophy has ever said. So I'm in this, yes?
Yeah, with very naive questions regarding a bit the history of philosophy. It's a question. Was the death of God something similar to what you're describing for philosophy at the time?
Oh, at the time.
Because the way you're describing it seems that it seems to me that subjectivity is just the breaking down of subjectivity or the shedding away of subjectivity is similar to the getting rid of God. We could not understand certain phenomena, we projected a transcendental being, we cannot understand certain phenomena of how we become ourselves, therefore we create an external body, a symbolic body, a subjective body.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. Yeah, I think it's similar to something like that. I mean, I still believe in deconstruction, you know, not as, we were talking about that yesterday, I guess, not as a doctrine, something which has to be preserved and sacralized here and there, but as a movement of the real. Okay, for me, deconstruction is not the production of a thinker. It is not Derrida's thing. Deconstruction is a movement of the real itself. The real reality is what deconstructs itself constantly, which means that the real is what kills the idols all the time, which in a way desubstantializes itself, lose its relationship to the sacred, to the essence, to the substance. And yes, well, the death of God is one major example of this loss. Nietzsche is very clear on that point. God is dead because we killed him. That is because it is a self-destruction. Okay? So I think this, well, deconstruction is going on, okay? But clearly not in philosophy. I think that deconstruction is Derrida has reached its limits, okay? And it's going on in quite another way, which is in biology. Tomorrow it will be somewhere else. Okay, now it is biology, now it's plasticity of life, etc. Tomorrow it will be elsewhere, and it will be something else. And yes, subjectivity is deflating in a way. It's like the loss of power of subjectivity due to the plasticity of life. Tomorrow it will be something else. And biology itself will be deconstructed. So what I'm talking about right now is absolutely transient. Okay? You cannot establish any dogma. I wouldn't say that plasticity is a philosophy. Certainly not. Right? I don't have a philosophy, it doesn't exist. It's just momentarily you grasp something like a movement in that deconstruction of the real. You just contemplate it at this moment when it happened. You don't let it escape because it's very important, so you don't ignore it. And according to me, it is traveling through biology today, so that's why I'm talking about that. But tomorrow I know that this will be, that plasticity will have become obsolete. Okay? So, to answer your question, yes, reality is deconstructing itself. The death of God was a major moment in that process. The emergence of deconstruction was another moment. The motive of destruction of metaphysics in Heidegger was another moment, etc., etc. Now we're moving toward a scientific kind of deconstruction. Tomorrow it will be something else. And what I'm just saying now will appear simply old-fashioned and conservative, and I'm absolutely aware of that. Okay? There's no end to this. At least I hope so. I hope we won't reach a point where everything, will be soon. That's why I have so many problems with Derridians in general, just because I think that what I do is deconstruction. Okay? Because precisely it is not linked to Derrida any longer. It is not a doctrine, it is a movement of the real, and we have to change our to change the general landscape of it, and we have to affirm that all these big names, Derrida and the others, are not important, and what is important is the movement of the real self deconstruction. Okay? I don't care about what Derrida thinks about this or that, what he would have said or not. Deconstruction does not belong to Derrida. It belongs to the real. It doesn't belong to me, of course, either. It belongs to the real. It is a movement of the real. And the death of God is just a moment of that, as I said, and there will be others. But for most Derridians, what I do is not deconstruction. Right? Because,
I was just in a convention of the European Society for Genetics, because I come from France. And I felt the need, I couldn't say that, the ethical aspect is, like, don't do that, you cannot, but isn't it important if you deconstruct the limit of the limit also there, because, they are heading towards brain scientist as well, of autism, of of conscious forms that are, and it's like a promoter, once you know a kid is going to be, schizoid, it will be a big mate to say you don't want to learn this kid. So how do you, and I find it's not completely clear, it's not really kind because you cure Alzheimer's, you cure cancer, and it's very personal at the end answer who wants to carry which child, to bring which child to work. But what would be a deconstructive way to approach this subject?
This is, of course, a very enormous question. I think that
not that this kind of banal will but allows that a deconstructive approach to this question.
A total redefinition of the concept of family, affiliation. Don't you think? Something like that. A total acceptance of the possibility of cloning. The end of the notions of genealogies. You see? Yeah. Sanguinity. Something like that.
I have a question about, maybe I kind of missed it and it sort of came up, but the degree to which this sort of understanding of plasticity in the brain serves as a sort of metaphor then for like whether it's geographic, political, or just social configurations then as well in terms of being like these, millions of synaptic connections within like people and these different configurations of the social. So is that how we're supposed to kind of think of it too, with this big sort of brain? And then I'm just wondering to what degree that serves as the metaphor and how that actually can be employed then in a discussion about the political and the productive social.
Yeah, it's very interesting, of course, because the problem, and this is the reason why we should go on doing philosophy, is that capitalism today is using the metaphor of the network and synaptic connections to describe the world.
Right.
So yeah, it is the privileged capitalist metaphor, the brain with neural synaptic connections, is the privileged metaphor for describing globalization and the way in which global exchanges are functioning. Okay? So we have to produce a critical definition of synaptic connections in order to differentiate them, or this model, from the capitalist description of the world. Okay? You know that I wrote a lot about the difference between flexibility and plasticity, because I think that's the capitalist use of the neural metaphor is a defense of flexibility. Right? It means, we're self-transformable. It means that we're endlessly flexible, and then we can be bent in all directions and do and work. And I think we have to oppose plasticity to flexibility. So yes, to answer your question, I think that the synaptic connection this model of the brain is absolutely political in its, the way in which the functioning is described. And Foucault is right on that point. It is political, there's no way in distinguishing between the biological and the political at this level, but we have to produce a non-capitalistic or ideological way of understanding the synaptic architecture. Okay? We have to resist the domination of flexibility at the same time. And we shouldn't confuse plasticity with and flexibility at this level. But yes, I think that the world is a big system of synaptic connections. And here again, this is transient. Tomorrow there will be another description. At the moment, this is yes. I think somebody wanted. No? I don't know.
I had a question about the old symbol of sovereignty, blood.
Yes.
Because it wasn't mentioned, well, how blood fits in general epigenetics.
Say it again, sorry.
It was just interesting for me talking about the organism that we've been saying, but there was nothing said about blood. So if there is a role
Of blood?
if blood is talked about in terms of the organism.
Oh, I think blood is the most plastic of you can give your blood, it reconstitutes itself because it makes immediately. It's very interesting. I think that blood stem cells are the most frequently used stem cells in replacement therapy today. So blood is very interesting material. If we accept to desacralize it, and we're not in a society of blood, as Foucault said, if we just look at it as a material, it's fascinating, very plastic. I like that very much. I'm also, well, perhaps you find me naive because I find that extremely interesting. You know, this is the reason why I'm working on that, because it fascinates me. You know, it's very interesting. Just looking at things, you know, seeing a brain regrowing itself. You know, in children, if you cut the brain in two, if you remove a half of the brain, it regrows. Blood regrows, etc. A liver is able to regrow, to regenerate. So blood is fascinating. I'm fascinated by these materials and materiality of life, and blood is part of that.
Quick question. Is there a philosophical critique of contemporary biology based on the questions of the thing on itself, of like being able to access really this material, or like questioning the how do you say? A question that we're actually seeing what we're seeing, that is not only. How can we claim that that it really works like this if we only have access to it through our perception and already symbolic apparatus?
Well, what we were talking about is objectively described by scientists. It's not a subjective approach. I mean, all the epigenetic things, etc., they are proved scientifically. It's not all about perception. I don't understand, perhaps.
I will reformulate.
Yeah, but no, I don't think you can find any philosophical approach to that. No. You have like cognitivist approaches, as I said, but in continental philosophy, no.
Because I'm thinking of Neyasu in his book After Finitude, where he tries to get over this limitation of not having access to the thing in itself, and he finds that in the artifossil, he finds that in maths.
Yeah, I know what you mean. For me, it's another kind of sovereignty. I'm very interested in what Neyasu does, by the way, but it's another kind of sovereignty, which is the sovereignty of mathematics over biology, which has to be deconstructed also. Okay? The way in which he approaches the absolute is with the help of mathematics. Okay? I don't see why we should privilege this over the biological absolute, which has nothing to do with finitude, because we are also challenging the notion of finitude here. You know, I'm trying to deconstruct this authenticity of death and the value of finitude as it is analyzed in Heidegger. Okay, so we're talking about another kind of absolute, which is the absolute materiality of life, and I don't see why. It is of less value than the mathematical absolute. For me, to affirm the superiority of mathematics over other sciences is a very old sovereign gesture. Like mathematics are being the noblest.
It's not a language.
Yeah. It's the sovereign of all sciences. You know, it's like the king. Mathematics are, you know, the very royal figure of science. I don't see why it should be like that. And biology has been very, you know, derived from that. The servants of mathematics. I think you can access the absolute through biology as well. I don't see why you should.
I have a question. I don't think it really impinges on your thinking at all, but I'm curious about what you know or think about epigenetics as being primarily not a hereditary kind of thing, but it's really in the individual, in sort of in the finite versus a more population-based level, that most of it is the development of a single particular organism is where it has most of its expression. I may be incorrect in that, but that's my understanding.
Epigenetic changes are heritable, but reversible. Okay? So somebody talks about Lamarck, we're talking about that. So it's a kind of return of Lamarckism in biology. So because these changes are heritable, but reversible, it means that they can change and stop existing at some point. Okay? So inheritance, and they also talk about that in their book, Evolution in Four Dimensions.
My understanding though is that it's not usually heritable, that it can be. There are instances of
inherit,
that it very often that it doesn't actually transmit to another generation.
but it can
But it
be. Okay?
can.
Can. So, yeah. So I don't know what the question was.
Well, no,
but-
like I said, I don't think either way, I don't think it really impinges on your thinking.
No.
Actually, but I was just curious about your studying and researching.
Even if it's very interesting about when you question transmission, inheritance, it changes a lot our Darwinian conception of inheritance. Because as you know, for Darwin, all these changes are not heritable. Well, I think we found enough. Thank you, and